I'm Mark Payne, the chair of the Classics Department, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the first lecture in our department's new lecture series. This new lecture series will showcase the most innovative new work in classical studies in the form of 4 lectures by a visiting scholar whose work is transforming the discipline as we speak. And we are very grateful to the Provost's Office for its remarkable generosity in making this new endeavor possible, and to the Humanities Division for all its support in making it happen. I am especially delighted to welcome Brooke Holmes to the University of Chicago for our inaugural lecture series. Brooke is professor of classics at Princeton University, where she holds the Elias Boudinot Bicentennial Preceptorship. Her first book, The Symptom and the Subject, The Emergence of the Physical Body in Ancient Greece, was published by Princeton University Press in 2010, and it is nothing less than a complete rethinking of the terms in which the Greek miracle should be understood. It is not the discovery of the mind, as Bruno Snell famously claimed, for which we are beholden to the Greeks, but the discovery of the body. The book draws deeply on Brooke's study of ancient medicine, but whereas this field, like ancient science more generally, has traditionally lived a life apart from the main currents of humanistic inquiry into classical antiquity, the technical discourse of medicine in Brooke's hands illuminates the full spectrum of Greek thought. The Symptom and the Subject examines poets, dramatists, sophists, philosophers, and historians, and sheds new light on them all, reconstituting the medical writers as the missing link between Greek poetry's staging of the remarkable individual and Greek philosophy's theorization of the human being in general. Brooke's second book, Gender, Antiquity, and Its Legacy, was published by Oxford University Press in their series, Antiquity and Its Legacy. The aim of this series is to demonstrate the continuing relevance of classical thought to a topic whose contours might seem to be determined by present concerns. And Brooke answers the call of the series in spectacular fashion, looking on the one hand at gender's constitutive role in the theoretical, social, and political practices of the ancient world, and on the other at contemporary theorists of gender whose critical interventions have been decisively shaped by their engagement with antiquity. The book models for its readers how it is that so much important work on gender has emerged from the study of antiquity. In addition to these books of her own, Brooke has found time for 2 edited volumes, one on antiquity's most loquacious invalid, Aelius Aristides, and one on the reception of Epicureanism, from Rome to the 20th century. Her own essay for the latter volume is on Gilles Deleuze's reading of Lucretius and was singled out for special attention in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in an article entitled Postmodern Lucretius. She also writes regularly on the visual arts. She has a wonderful essay on Carl André's materialism for a Dia Foundation volume on André, and a work in progress on Ronnie Horn's You Are the Weather. Brooke's lectures for us are entitled The Tissue of the World, Sympathy in Greco-Roman Antiquity, and they will outline a project that promises to be no less important than the symptom and the subject. The project investigates the emergence of sympathy as a way of thinking about the natural world and the relationships between its members, a conceptual habit, as Brooke calls it, the guided inquiry in a host of ancient intellectual practices in antiquity, not just the physical and biological sciences, but ethics, politics, and poetics. Like the body as a conceptual object in the symptom and the subject, sympathy as a conceptual habit in the tissue of the world is constantly expanding its territory. But as I understand it, the terrain of the present investigation begins with the first glimmerings of the idea of sympathy in the twilight of classical natural philosophy, and from there moves on to consider its efflorescence in the cosmologies of Hellenistic thought, where it appears alongside parallel developments in poetry, zoology, and medicine. Brooke's work stands out in classical studies today, not only because of its remarkable capacity to envisage ancient literature, philosophy, and science in the light of a single concern, but also because it is able to investigate the full range of evidence in these fields with the kind of understanding that is proper to each of them. What impresses me most about Brooke's work, however, is that her meticulously researched conceptual histories always have a paradigmatically reflexive character as well. In rediscovering the body as a discovery, what we rediscover is ourselves, as unknown to ourselves, as if historia, when it is most truly itself, were always in the middle voice. Sympathy will also be a rich field for such disclosures. So please join me now in welcoming Brooke for the first of her lectures, The Sympathetic Cosmos.
So thank you so much, Mark, for that generous and articulate introduction. We might all go home now. It's really wonderful. Thank you, and it's really a pleasure to be here. It's been incredibly stimulating to have been in Chicago already these past 4 weeks, and I'm looking forward to the next 5 weeks. So thank you again for having me. So I want to begin today with a haunting fragment from the 20th century artist Agnes Martin. Everyone is chosen, and everyone knows it, including animals and plants. There is only the all of the all. Everything is that. Every infinitesimal thought and action is part and parcel of a wonderful victory. Freedom on the mountain, a glimpse of victory. We seem to be winning and losing, but in reality, there is no losing. The wiggle of a worm as important as the assassination of a president. So, what kind of world do we find ourselves in here? Martin is famous for having spent the second half of her life in virtual isolation on a mesa in New Mexico, creating her luminous grid paintings. Her radical withdrawal from the world was, by her own account, a necessary condition of her art practice. She conceived of this practice in sparely spiritual terms. Art making seeks the perfection and the beauty that we see with the mind's eye. Now, Martin's concept of a cool beauty beyond the realm of the sensible points toward Plato. And Plato is indeed a signal presence in the handful of lapidary texts that have been generated from Martin's interviews, writings, and notes. The phenomenal world is a riot of things that go to and fro. The true reality lies somewhere else, in forms or abstractions beyond or within the self. Yet while Martin sometimes speaks of nature as a screen to be passed through, here we see her pausing on the surface of the world. Everyone is chosen, including the animals and the plants. The play of organic life opens on to the all of the all, a perfect encompassing unity in which every aspect of the world is recuperated into a wonderful victory. So here is a world that is entirely self-sufficient and cohesive and intact, all the austere values of idealism. Yet the very perfection of the whole is immanent in every one of its parts. Objects and events acquire, each on their own terms, cosmic importance. So what Martin gives us is a cosmos that's animated by different perspectives. We move from everyone, every singularity, to the all of the all. The world is at once flattened and at the same time ordered by the orchestration of parts at the level of the whole. So we dwell simultaneously in the soil and in the stars. I've promised to talk today about the sympathetic cosmos in the first of 4 lectures that try to map out the space of what the ancients, Romans and Greeks alike, referred to as sympathia, sympathy. Now, what they meant by this, in the most basic sense, was not what you might expect. So they're not talking about a relationship between persons. Rather, sympathy described a mode of relationship distributed throughout the entire world, from worms and fungi all the way up to celestial bodies. And sympathy also described the relationship between parts within organic and non-organic wholes. Now, I don't know if Martin would describe what she's talking about here as sympathy. It's true that Platonism is one of the most trafficked conduits for cosmological sympathy between the ancient world and the modern. This is the case despite the fact that the dialogue at the head of this tradition, the Timaeus, does not in fact mention the word. The efflorescence of cosmological sympathy within the philosophical tradition will be due rather to the Stoics, through whom it passes into Neoplatonism in late antiquity, and then on to Ficino and Leibniz and points beyond. I suspect that in some way Martin, with her Platonism, at once pure and wild, monkish and painterly, inhabits and is inhabited by a kind of ancient sympathy. And what I have to say in these lectures is, in an important sense, an argument deeply embedded in history and its reverberations in the present. Yet I begin with Martin not primarily as a moment of reception. I start with her because she gets to the heart of what it means to think sympathetically about the world. She gets to the heart of what sympathy means as what I'll call a conceptual habit. So one of the hallmarks of thinking sympathetically, as Martin demonstrates, is thinking in two ways at once. In the domain of sympathy, we find together an often pious commitment to the unity, completeness, and the perfection of the world. And at the same time, we find a tarrying with its parts and its particulars. Whether observing symbiotic plants or tidal patterns, magnetic attraction or mother's milk coming in, ancient authors don't just see two bodies in relation to one another. They see, too, a principle of connectivity as a feature of the world, and indeed as its defining feature. At the same time, sympathy leads the other direction from abstract notions of wholeness to the particular waxing and waning of, say, a mouse's liver or the bloom of pennyroyal. In sympathy, we scale up and down in the same breath. We travel horizontally across a plane of beings all participating in the life of the cosmos, but we also travel vertically down from a master order that is imposed on the many parts. The dynamism of sympathy can account, I think, for the long-term labor that it will do within the Western tradition in support of the concept of nature with a capital N. That dynamism also entails an instability that ensures that nature will never not be the name of a problem. Much of what I want to do over the next 4 weeks has to do with using sympathy in its instability to get at something of this problem called nature. In fact, sympathy has long posed a problem to historians of ancient philosophy and science, but of a rather different kind. So the difficulty comes down to the fact that ancient sympathy falls under the category of discredited claims about how the natural world works. And not just that, it flaunts the persistence of magical thinking or primitive mentality into supposedly rationalizing traditions of cosmology, natural history, astrology, medicine, and so on. So we encounter sympathy in this context as little more than an embarrassment. Now, we might think that these Whiggish ways of thinking are a thing of the past. But in a recent book, Darren LaHoo has argued that, or rather indirectly suggested, that they are alive and well. So for LaHoo, sympathy together with antipathy constitutes the paradigmatic case of what he calls really weird science from antiquity that tests the capacity of historians of science to make sense of ancient texts about the natural world. So LaHoo's project is to find a way to account for sympathy and antipathy without just relying on the credulity of the ancients, thereby recuperating classical antiquity more generally for the history of science. And he does, in fact, quite a persuasive job of this. For LaHoo, entrenched beliefs about sympathy and antipathy in Greco-Roman authors make better sense if we see them in terms of the categories that we use to make expectations about the physical world, not just in antiquity, but today as well. So what matters to LaHoo here is a theoretical claim about cognitive behavior in general. So he doesn't actually care that much about sympathy and antipathy themselves, so they're test cases for him because they're such fantastical ideas. My own strategy of rehabilitating sympathy and antipathy is rather different. So what will interest me is precisely the complex worldview that sympathy and sometimes antipathy supports. So I'm especially interested in those moments when the crackling energies of sympathy and antipathy encourage speculation about the kind of world that supports the circulation of these energies. So if sympathy is a problem for the history of philosophy and science because it's too magical, it's also actually been a problem for the history of magic. The reason for this has to do much with the history of scholarship and the historical significance of sympathy in accounts of magic. So importantly, sympathy is central to the definition of magic in Sir James George Fraser's seminal 19th century text, The Golden Bough. The belief in the sympathetic influences exerted on each other by persons or things at a distance, Fraser writes, is of the essence in magic. Faith in telepathy is one of its first principles. Yet Fraser's enthusiasm for sympathy turned out to be noxious. As ancient historians have retreated from earlier approaches to magic, and also away from narratives of the decline of a paganism infected by foreign magic and superstition, they've also retreated from the concepts exemplary of a primitive mentality, and sympathy is one of the most paradigmatic of these concepts. The problem with Fraser on Fritz Graf's diagnosis is that he takes what had become a technical term in late antiquity, namely sympathia, and makes it metonymic of a whole mentalité. And so reversing Fraser's mistake means getting rid of sympathy. Or as Graf vividly puts it, quote, since the notion of primitive thinking has melted away like snow in sunlight, sympathy will also have to disappear. So the challenge for Graf is how to describe what remains when you take away sympathy as an organizing principle. But this leaves us with another problem. How did sympathy become a technical term at all? And what kind of work does it do in this capacity? So I'm not going to be trying to answer these precise questions today, but let me sketch a few introductory thoughts. First, there's a significant difference between sympathy taken as a general principle of thought at work in the past and the self-conscious use of sympathy as a technical term. If we survey the evidence for the use of sympathia, it seems that we're dealing with a word that entered circulation sometime on the cusp of the Hellenistic period in the later 4th century BCE. And for the story that I want to tell, this little philological fact matters a lot. I'm not interested here in asking whether sympathy is a useful way of thinking about associative thought patterns or for explaining magical thinking in general. Rather, it's important to me that sympathia gains traction as a quasi-technical term in specific domains at a specific point in history under specific conceptual conditions. The Romans use a range of terms in order to translate sympathia, most commonly consensus, but also cognatio, contagio, and conjunctio. But they also will often refer to what the Greeks call sympatheia. So this self-conscious use of the Greek term among authors writing in Latin drives home the word's status as a specific descriptor, as well as its intimate association with Greek traditions of natural philosophy and natural history. So in short then, starting in the later 4th century, the term sympatheia appears to denote something quite specific for a range of different authors working within different areas of inquiry, including natural history, medicine, astrology, cosmology, and psychology. Now, this something that sympathy describes is sometimes just a given. But the more deeply that sympatheia, is embedded in a given intellectual context, the more work it does to enable, confirm, sustain, and propel thinking about the cosmos, about non-human nature, and about human nature itself. So the best known of the intellectual domains that sympathy inhabits is Stoicism, and indeed sympathy is often seen as a Stoic concept. It's true that the Stoics are absolutely central to a history of sympathy. But sympathy is not just a Stoic concept, and an approach that presupposes a proprietary relationship of Stoicism to sympathy is not just narrow, but I think potentially misleading. From Pliny to Galen to Plotinus, sympathy is elaborated in different ways in local contexts and intellectual traditions, sometimes on its own and sometimes in relationship to its opposite, antipathy. So part of my aim in these lectures is to be attentive to these kinds of conditions. And so I've organized the lectures around 3 domains where sympathy operates: the cosmic, the terrestrial, and the microcosmic. Now, from this perspective, it might seem more appropriate to talk about sympathies rather than sympathy in the singular. Nevertheless, I want to insist that sympathy is, that all of these sympathies are facets of a coherent phenomenon. What can get lost through a focus on sympathy within one author or school is that there are significant points of overlap among the worldviews that sympathy encourages within particular contexts. And this is one reason that I'll talk about a conceptual habit as opposed to just a concept. With that term, I'm trying to capture not only the dynamism of sympathy, although that's an important part of what I mean too, but also these shared rhythms or tracks of theorizing and imagining sympathy across different intellectual domains and contexts. So the strategy here is to try to steer clear between a Scylla and a Charybdis, to avoid, on the one hand, diffuse generalizations about sympathy as just a product of primitive thought or thought in general, or a workhorse of ancient worldviews or weird science, and on the other hand, to avoid narrow genealogies of sympathy that are mostly about tracking its influence from one domain to another. So instead, I want to keep together both the range of sympathies and their convergence in a shared conceptual space. The stakes of thinking about sympathy expansively and ambitiously are potentially high. One of the most pressing problems on the table in the theoretical humanities and the social sciences today is how to conceptualize a community that encompasses humans and non-humans, or more simply, how to theorize the relation beyond the human. Ancient sympathy in this context looks like a conceptual resource worth taking a new look at. And in fact, there have been signs of a rising interest in sympathy across a number of domains, from literary history to anthropology, from philosophy to political theory. So let me say up front that my aim here is not actually going to be to recuperate sympathy as a long-lost mode of thought that we should somehow embrace in our disenchanted times. I do think that trying to inhabit the thought world of Sympathia can bring into focus some of the challenges that we face in trying to conceptualize the relationship between the human and the non-human. And I believe that sympathy can even offer resources for meeting those challenges. Yet at the same time, one of the things I'm most interested in is how sympathy encourages the rise of a concept of nature with a capital N. At a moment when that concept has come under critique in the crucible of ecological crisis, it's useful to try to better understand how and why nature becomes so entrenched within the Western tradition. Tracking sympathy, I want to suggest, is part of this genealogical labor. The genealogical aspect of the work is why going back to classical antiquity is different than pursuing what the anthropologist Philippe Descola would call the ecology of others, that is, the ecology of non-Western cultures, which is often defined by the absence of nature with a capital N, or a concept of nature in general. But at the same time, the very strangeness of ancient sympathy is a reminder that there isn't a continuous line from antiquity to the present moment. One reason, then, that sympathy is such a powerful idea now is precisely its doubleness, its complicity with Western ideas of nature, as well as its total unfamiliarity. And in light of its doubleness, we could understand an inquiry into Sympathia as a call to an ecology that Nietzsche might call untimely. I'll return to this claim in my last lecture. But here I want to now turn to specifics. So let's take a look at the Stoics and sympathy on a cosmic scale. So the Stoics will loom large in any history of sympathy, and sympathy in turn seems to have been at the heart of Stoic physics. It has to be said that mapping the dynamics of Stoic sympathy is a task that's very much hampered by the absence of primary sources. So we have virtually nothing from the major Stoic authors writing in Greek, and so we have to rely largely on their later, especially Roman adherents, and on doxographers and critics, and of course all of these people had their own agendas. And what we do have doesn't make it easy at all to follow the diachronic development of sympathy within Stoicism. So although Karl Reinhardt at the beginning of the 20th century put considerable effort into crediting Posidonius with the doctrine, most scholars today see it as a core principle from early in the tradition. And so I'll follow them in speaking of sympathy as just a Stoic idea in general. What's most important, I think, is that the evidence we do have suggests that the Stoics were keen to see and to show sympathy in the world around them as manifest proof of their cosmological and metaphysical doctrines. So one of the best places to observe this deictic mode is Cicero's On the Nature of Gods. So in the course of a series of arguments about the nature of God, the Stoic mouthpiece Balbus deploys sympathy as decisive evidence of his school's theology and cosmology. So there's a handout, and then I've also just put translations of the texts on the PowerPoint. So who will not be compelled, Balbus says, by the sympathetic agreement, interconnection, and affinity of things? He goes on to list the seasons, the lunar influence of the tides, the courses of the stars, all of which ostensibly prove the presence of a single divine, all-pervading breath, spiritus. And similarly, in his On Divination, Cicero, playing the skeptic, says that the Stoics have collected much evidence to prove that there's some kind of natural connection, a cognatio naturalis, in the nature of things. So again, I'll just summarize rather than reading the whole passage. Oysters and shellfish that wax and wane with the waxing and waning of the moon, flowers that bloom at the arrival of the winter solstice, trees whose sap lessens in winter, making them easier to cut. So the Stoic attention to these facts is confirmed by Sextus Empiricus. Like Balbus, he makes the argument from Sympathy, the grand finale, in a catalog of Stoic arguments about the nature of God. Again, we find him pointing to the coordination between the phases of the moon and the waxing and waning of animals on land and sea, pointing to the tides and the large-scale effects of climactic change, the alterations in surrounding atmosphere, he says. And then he paraphrases the climax of the Stoic argument. And from these facts, it is obvious, symphonis, that the cosmos is a unified body. So there are a couple of things to note about these passages. First, in the passages from On the Nature of Gods and Sextus, sympathy is a fact that can compel belief in something else, a single all-pervading breath, and the cosmos, the status of the cosmos as a unified body, respectively. That is, in other words, the springboard to inferences about the nature of the world. So what exactly is being taken as given here? It isn't the tide or the bloom of certain flowers, and it isn't the natural bodies or events that these becomings get put in touch with, the moon or the solstices, for example. Rather, what's being posited as observed and irrefutable fact is the relation itself. And it would seem that even the critics of the Stoics felt that this was a feature of the world that needed to be explained. So Cicero will deny the Stoic arguments about divination, but he easily concedes that there must be some kind of connection in the nature of things, aliquo in natura rerum cognatio. And Cotta, Balbus's academic critic and On the Nature of the Gods, also allows in Book 3 of that treatise that the Stoics' collection of facts requires an explanation. But he chalks the phenomena in question up to largely spontaneous forces in nature, naturae viribus. The willingness of Cicero and Cotta to see sympathy as given on the surface of the world is echoed by a number of other authors writing in antiquity without Stoic affiliations. Yet if even critics of Stoicism acknowledge sympathy, I think we have to concede that this was in part because of some work done by the Stoics themselves. So Cicero tells us in On Divination that the Stoics collected much evidence in order to prove that there was some natural connection in the world of things. So sympathy here is actually not a fact, but it's something that has to be proven through the work of induction. And Cicero's examples give a hint of Stoic practice. In his commentary on the text, ASPs provides a long list of comparanda where the phenomena cataloged by Cicero are mentioned by other ancient authors. And in most of these cases, sympathy or its Latin cognates are not mentioned. So what the Stoics seem to have done is to mine repositories of facts in natural history, as well as their own cultural imaginary. And so I'm thinking here especially of long-held beliefs about the influence of the moon on living things. So they mined these resources for examples that could be appropriated as evidence of cosmic sympathy. But at the same time, I want to stress that this doesn't mean that the Stoics were necessarily the first or the only people who were trying in this period to see or to show sympathy. So Pliny, for example, frames his 12 books on materia medica in the natural history as a survey of what the Greeks call sympathy and antipathy, and I'll come back to this text next week. His source has been plausibly identified as the shadowy bolus of Mendes, sometimes known as Pseudo-Democritus, who was credited in antiquity with a text called On Sympathies and Antipathies. And then there's also a book from the Pseudo-Aristotelian Problemata, probably from the late 4th or early 3rd century, that's labeled Problems Arising from Sympathy. But interestingly, apart from the title, it doesn't actually contain the word sympathia. It's likely then that the kinds of problems queried, that most of them have to do with involuntary mimetic behaviors like contagious yawning, were retroactively identified as cases of sympathy once the category had stabilized. Philo, who's writing in the 1st century, attributes the work of showing cosmic sympathy to the Chaldean astrologers. So what these examples suggest is a push from a range of quarters to see the world in terms of sympathy and sometimes antipathy in the early Hellenistic period. But then again, the Stoics do seem to have been major players in this process, especially as it concerns sympathy on a cosmic scale. And to the extent that they succeed in doing this, the battle shifts away from the surface of sympathy to its hidden causes. But the Stoics, of course, aren't just interested in showing that sympathy exists out in the world. Rather, the truth of the sympathetic relation is being mobilized to prove other, deeper truths. So let's take a closer look then at what sympathy makes visible in the Stoics. I'll begin with what the Stoics themselves say, or their sources, before turning to a less straightforward plane of visibility, to a knot of ideas that cluster around the figure of the organic body. So we can start with Sextus's claim that sympathy proves the cosmos is a unified body. And the expression that he uses here, henomenon ti soma, is a technical term. So the Stoics, as Sextus himself tells us, distinguish between three types of bodies. The simplest of these are flocks, choruses, and armies. In other words, loose groupings that are composed of separate elements. The next category includes bodies whose elements are joined together, like ships or cables or turrets are the examples, synaptomena in Greek. Now, in both of these cases, the parts can survive the destruction of the whole. For these bodies do not, by definition, sustain sympathy between their parts. This is number 5 on the handout, if you're following there. For example, even Sextus says if an entire army, save one soldier, dies, the one who survives seems to suffer nothing through transmission, kare diadosen. By contrast, if a finger is cut, the whole body suffers its pain. And that's because organic bodies, unlike armies and ships, are unified, phenomena. The parts all depend on a larger whole. In light of its sympathies, the cosmos, too, the Stoics conclude, must be a unified body. But all of this will only get us so far. The next question becomes, what gives a unified body its defining cohesion? And here we can go back to Balbus's claim in On the Nature of the Gods that the remarkable co-feeling, co-breathing, continuous affinity of all things bears witness to the presence of an all-pervading breath, spiritus, which is translating the Greek pneuma. So further confirmation of the role of pneuma in cohesion comes from a paraphrase of Chrysippus in Alexander of Aphrodisias. So the whole of substance is unified, henosthai, because it is totally pervaded by a pneuma through which the whole is held together, is stable, and is sympathetic with itself. Now, the emphasis in both sources on the claim that pneuma is everywhere is a reminder that for the Stoics, there is no void in the cosmos. The absence of void is part of what makes sympathy possible. And we can see this in two sources, from Diogenes Laerces, there's no empty space, as well as from Cleomedy. If there was void, sympathy would not be possible. But the next question then becomes, what is so special about pneuma that gives it the power to endow a unified body, whether a microcosmic part or a cosmic whole, with this special cohesion? The answer has to do with, in part, with the tension, or what's called the tensional power of the pneuma. The Stoics refer to this as tonos. Tonos is a fundamentally dynamic notion arising from the twofold nature of pneuma as air and fire. So the cold air contracts inward and the hot air expands outward. It's easiest to understand these tensional breaths by taking a look at their consequences for individual microcosmic bodies. That's because one of the most important things about tonos is that it varies from body to body depending on the proportion of qualities, so hot, cold, wet, and dry. So these tensional variations account for the particular qualities of a body, for the sheen of silver, for example, or the hardness of a diamond. And they also create another subset of categories of unified bodies. Like the three classes of bodies, so the flocks, the ships, and the organic bodies, these subclasses are ranked in an ascending order according to the complexity of the structure that's created by pneuma. So the lowest rung is occupied by rocks, and here pneuma creates a cohesion which is called hexis, sometimes translated as tenor. When you get to plants, it's called phusis, or nature. When you get to animals, it's called psyche, or soul. When you get to rational human beings, you have reason through the further refinement of pneuma. And finally, in gods and sages, and importantly, in the cosmos, you get the most refined pneuma, which creates the conditions for perfect reason. So with these examples in front of us, we can see why structure is actually a better word than cohesion. Pneuma does not just hold a body together. Rather, it creates a single state in which every part is bound up with every other part and the whole. So as Cato puts it in Cicero's On Ends, for the Stoics, all of nature is so tightly interwoven that if you alter a single letter, the entire whole will collapse. These are the conditions which entail sympathy, and sympathy can be made to support larger claims about cosmic order as well as cohesion. And these conditions also point to the power of pneuma to create wholes that are greater than the sum of their parts. That power points to the high ontological status of pneuma in the Stoic system. And this might be surprising because it's technically a compound of elements and so ontologically derivative. But it clearly has more importance. Indeed, at least from Chrysippus onwards, pneuma functions as the corporeal vehicle or the material vehicle for one of the two fundamental metaphysical principles of Stoicism, namely the active principle, which the Stoics also refer to as God, nature, fate, providence, reason, mind, and Zeus. Pneuma, then, is how cosmic mind pervades and acts on all matter, that is, the passive principle. Now, as we just saw, the qualities of pneuma differ as it passes through different kinds of unified bodies. So worms and stars or oysters and toddlers all have different mixtures, as it were, of pneuma. Yet the work of pneuma in the cosmic animal is to recuperate these different bodies into a single whole. It is then to create inwardly cohesive bodies, but also to open them to other bodies and to the enveloping macrocosm. So by bearing witness to sympathy on a grand scale, the Stoics enlist it as proof of the life, or the perfect life, of the cosmos. Now, I'm going to use the word life here advisedly, for it's worth emphasizing that in the proofs from sympathy that we saw earlier, life is not actually at stake. The presence of sympathy will prove that a body is cohesive. It will prove the all-pervading presence of divine breath, but it doesn't actually prove anything more. Neither reason nor life is a necessary property of a unified body. Or to put it another way, cohesion is both necessary and sufficient for sympathy. Sympathy is exhibited as much by lifeless bodies as it is by living ones, by stones as much as by sages. And in fact, the Stoics don't try to claim otherwise. They lean not on sympathy, but on a battery of syllogisms in order to prove the claim that the cosmos is animate, sentient, and intelligent. So one of Zeno's favorites, we're told by Cicero, again in On the Nature of Gods, goes something like this. If flutes that played tunes grew on olive trees, you wouldn't question that the olive tree had some nature of flute playing. So why then would anyone question that the world is animate and wise when it produces offspring that are animate and wise? Now, these arguments were not watertight, they were not always original, and they did not go unchallenged, but you cannot blame the Stoics for not trying to back up their claims about the nature of the cosmos in ways that don't involve sympathy. Nevertheless, the belief that the cosmos is an intelligent animal no doubt ranks high among what Michael White calls the Stoics' prior commitments. Now, these commitments themselves have antecedents. The pre-Socratics, more often than not, seem to have seen the world as divine. But the real watershed moment comes from Plato's Timaeus, where the cosmos is expressly envisioned as an animal, alive, sentient, and intelligent. And the influence of that dialogue on the Stoics is widely accepted. Yet biology only goes so deep in the Timaeus, where craft analogies predominate. For the elaboration of biological models, the Stoics could turn to Aristotle. But for Aristotle, biology is worked out primarily at the level of the individual organism. He rejects Plato's world soul as well as the demiurge. It was left to the Stoics then to embrace biological life on a cosmic scale. In so doing, they develop what David Hom felicitously calls cosmobiology. So I want to suggest that the Stoics' commitment to radical cosmobiology is actually necessary to understanding the work that sympathy does in Stoic physics and metaphysics, as well as the tensions that it creates. More specifically, sympathy indirectly, but nevertheless suggestively supports the Stoic arguments that the cosmos isn't just a cohesive body, but something more, something alive, sentient, and intelligent. Indirectly, because as we just saw, sympathy in and of itself cannot prove that the cosmos has those properties. but suggestively, because there's evidence that the organic body from an early point was a privileged site for the expression of sympathy, not only between different parts, but between parts and a whole. The argument that the affections of the smallest parts affect the whole body is already found in the 5th century treatise on places in a human being, which we'll come back to later. There's also evidence that the concept of sympathy was gaining particular traction in the 4th century BC as a way of describing the relationship between soul and body as separate but mutually affected parts of a single organism, and specifically the human being. And the organic body is a crucial locus of sympathy within the Stoics themselves. So recall the passage that we saw earlier from Sextus, where he recounts a common Stoic argument. In marshalling evidence for the claim that unified bodies exhibit sympathy, Sextus gives us an example. If the finger is cut, the whole body will suffer. Here the Stoics use the human microcosm in order to prove that sympathy is a sign of the unified body. And for the argument to work, the unity of the human body has to be presumed. That we feel pain when a finger is cut empirically secures the claim that sympathy is a property of unified bodies. So after the dependence of sympathy on cohesion is established through the microcosm, Sextus can return to the claim that the cosmos is a unified body because it exhibits sympathy. The Stoics also recognize sympathy between body and soul. Here, for example, is their argument for the incorporeality of the soul, reported by Nemesius. So no incorporeal suffers together with the body, and no body with an incorporeal. But the soul suffers with the body when it is sick and being cut, and the body with the soul. Thus, when the soul feels shame and fear, the body turns red and white, respectively. Therefore, the soul is a body. So there's a givenness to the sympathy in the organic body, both inside and outside Stoicism, that supports its visibility at the macroscopic level. The privileged place of the organic body in arguments from sympathy suggests that when sympathy travels from the microcosm to the macrocosm in Stoicism, it trails a knot of ideas about ensouled and embodied life. It would appear then that for the Stoics, sympathy is a deeply organic concept. And we might think that there's actually nothing surprising about this. What else would you expect from a cohort of radical cosmobiologists? And indeed, the sympathy of the Stoics is often approached from this point of unsurprise. But I want to see the organicism trailed by sympathy rather as an invitation to think about sympathy as a mode through which the Stoics and philosophies of nature more generally are haunted by the complexities of organicism at both the micro and the macro level. So I'm going to start to unpack this claim today by arguing that sympathy resonates differently depending on whether you approach it through the lens of the active principle, that is mind, or the lens of the passive principle, matter. Put another way, I'm going to suggest that sympathy exaggerates the nature of cohesive bodies and the cosmos itself as body and mind, as matter and God, as receptivity and top-down order. At the same time, sympathy carves out a conceptual space to hold these aspects of the organic body together in dynamic tension. So in short, sympathy signals the openness and the affectability of living beings, as well as their inner determination, their closedness around a determinate end. So let's start then with these notions of openness and affectability. So think for a moment about what sympathia is not. In earlier texts, unity on a grand scale is often cast in terms of symphonia or harmonia, words that are both associated with Pythagoreanism. And when classical writers talk about symphonia, they imply that two or more things are in agreement with one another in a way that's like the concord produced by a harmony of two or more musical notes. Plato, for example, talks about the symphonia of the parts of the soul, which can be brought about by certain kinds of music or by stargazing. If music or astronomy is psychically efficacious, it's because the soul has a share in mathematicized reality. For Plato, as well as for the Pythagoreans, the more ideal the object, the less entangled it is in matter, and so the purer its harmonies. So participation is located at what we might call the highest common denominator. By contrast, the common ground of bodies that are connected through sympathy lies in their ability to be affected, to undergo pathe. The fact that affectability is the property in play here is not surprising, given the Stoic definition of body as that which is affected and affects, what we just saw in the proof of the corporeality of the soul. Now, in theory, pathos is a neutral idea. In practice, pathos is not a neutral word. In the early medical writers, it almost always points to a damaged condition. In the ethical tradition, the idea of pathos, qua sensation or emotion, was a negatively charged one, and nowhere more so than in the Stoics themselves, who famously prized the ethical ideal of apatheia. The negative valence of pathos bleeds through some of what seem to have been paradigmatic examples of sympathy within the Stoic tradition. So in the example from Nemesius, for example, sympathy occurs in the body that falls ill or gets cut, or the soul that's ashamed or afraid. In the passage that we saw earlier from Sextus, sympathy is made manifest again when the finger is cut. Pain is again central to an analogy from Heraclitus that the Stoics appropriated to talk about the soul's permeation of the body. This is handout number 10. So in the Heraclitus fragment, the soul hurries towards a wound like a spider sensing a tear in its web and scurrying towards the site of damage. In the version ascribed to Chrysippus, the soul doesn't travel but perceives an impact to the flesh through the taut medium of Pneuma. Still, in Chrysippus, the image of damage continues. And readers of Deleuze's Logique du Sens will know that the cut is actually a recurrent theme in Stoic logic as well. So I want to suggest then that one of the consequences of making the organic body so central to the trope of sympathy is that the Stoics elicit, whether deliberately or unconsciously, a sense of pathos as a sign of vulnerability. Moreover, the attention to each part as a portal to the whole means that vulnerability is distributed throughout the organism. So the interlocking of the parts means that the susceptibility of any one part to being affected will put the entire organism at risk. This distributed vulnerability is, of course, one of the consequences of making affectability the ground of community, namely that parts are not just subordinated to the ends of the whole, but they have a power over the integrity of that whole. Now, everything that I've just said about vulnerability makes sense for the microcosm. But things will get complicated when we pass from the microcosm to the macrocosm, for at least two reasons. First, unlike bodies that are buoyed in a flux of matter, the cosmos, like the cosmic animal of the Timaeus, is fully self-sufficient. What happens to the cosmos does not open it to an outside, but is internal to it. The world does not impinge on the organism, but is rather contained by it. That's the first problem. Second, when the finger is cut, damage will ripple from the part to the whole. But by contrast, if we go back to the examples that we started with, we can see that the focus isn't really on how the suffering of one part is communicated to the whole. Instead, it seems to be on an all-pervasive force that acts on different parts of the whole in a coordinated way. Rather than in the flesh sending its pain to the soul, the flesh of the world receives the pneumatic ripples of causality. Indeed, some of the paradigmatic images of cosmic sympathy, so tidal flows or flowering trees, don't suggest a world in pain at all. They suggest a world that is dynamic and alive, a world permeated by a quivering sensibility. But then again, these two ideas, vulnerability and vitality, are not unrelated. When the Stoics see sympathy, they see in one sense the vulnerability of the interconnected body, a risky openness to the world that's magnified by the communicability of affection within a cohesive body. But they also see sympathy as a body's pulsing connection to the rhythms of other bodies due to a common receptivity to a vital force. On both counts, I'd suggest sympathy exaggerates the passive principle as an openness to being affected. Being alive and being damaged are two sides of the same coin, namely being in an organic body. So the riskiness of life is part of the condition of dynamic becoming. Yet again, we still seem to be here at the level of the individual microcosm. So what are the implications of openness, if any, for the sympathetic cosmos? The first thing to say here is that the very pulsation of sympathy on a grand scale reveals the limitation of drawing too sharp a line between the microcosm and the macrocosm. For the full sense of an organism's life only comes into view in the Stoics once it's embedded within a larger sympathetic web. This is an important difference between Aristotle's notion of a nature with its own telos as a somewhat contained track, and the Stoic emphasis on individual beings as embedded within a larger matrix. So Cleomedes, and this is number 11 on the handout, says the fact that all individuals are in relation to others is one proof that nature controls the cosmos. The sympathy between the parts is another one. For the Stoics, then, sympathy is both what connects the parts of an organic body and what connects that body to other bodies in the cosmos. And what this means is that macrocosmic sympathy has to be understood not just as a form of analogical extension where the organism becomes the cosmos. It's also crucially a form of enmeshment where the boundaries of an organism are being renegotiated. The sympathetic cosmos involves the openness of part wholes to the larger whole as well as to one another. But I think there's also a stronger claim to be made here. It's frankly very hard to imagine an organism that is completely self-sufficient. Plato's heroic attempt in the Timaeus, where the cosmic animal eats its own excrement, performs the difficulties. What this means in the Stoic context, I'd suggest, is that the enmeshed parts of the cosmos become powerfully metonymic. If the coordinated life cycles of the moon and flowers and shellfish point to sympathy within the cosmic whole, they also persuasively enact a richer notion of sympathy as evidence of openness as well as cohesion. And it's worth stressing again that sympathy, this enriched notion of sympathy belongs to the most humble natures precisely because it privileges affectability. So the life of the worm both is and is not the life of the cosmos. So I've been arguing that sympathy, as the word itself suggests, draws out the implications of mattering, of being in matter for organic beings, as well as for the cosmos as a whole. But what about the other side of organic life, what I described above as its inwardness, its closedness? And here we have to go back to the principle of cohesion. Earlier we saw how an all-pervading pneuma guarantees the cohesion of unified bodies, expressing that cohesion differentially in stones and plants and animals and human beings, as well as in gods. In each case, the integrity of the whole is secured by the coherence of the organism, a sympathy between its parts. That is, enmeshment isn't only the condition of vulnerability. It also enlists the parts in the dynamic work of the whole, which is understood, at least at the level of the organic body, as a specific form of life. From this angle, sympathy expresses the coordination of parts under the directive power of pneuma qua active principle, or more accurately, under the direction of God or nature. So it points to a top-down system. Now, the system that is, of course, the most top-down is when we zoom out to consider the sympathetic cosmos as a whole. And the questions that arise when you start thinking about the entire cosmos as an organism is, of course, what is its nature? What are its ends? From this angle, the parts, that is, the individual organisms, are sucked up into the life of the whole, into a master plan, we might say. And in fact, the Stoics were very, very big on master plans. For one thing, they were strongly committed to the view that lower order bodies exist for the sake of higher order ones. So if from one angle, the worm is on equal footing with the president, from another, the Stoic cosmos is a rigid scala naturae. Pneuma does indeed pervade the entire world, but it distributes mind and reason unevenly, thereby producing natural relationships of subordination. So Chrysippus famously said that the pig exists in order to keep bacon fresh for us. But we are ourselves no more than parts of the whole. Our lives are part of its life. We've seen this integration of parts into the whole in terms of natural cycles. But the turn to the human part is a good occasion to stress that the Stoics were enthusiastic determinists, committed to the idea of fate as one big web, symploche, of causes. The discussion of sympathy in Cicero's On Divination comes up in just this context. Cicero says that he's willing to accept what he calls some kind of cognatio or kinship within the nature of things, but he draws a line at the kinds of connections between things that divination wants to presume. So what's the connection, he asks, between a cleft in an animal's liver and my lucky windfall? One obeys the laws of nature, the other the laws of human lives. But for the Stoics, this division into natural laws and the laws of human events is entirely illegitimate. The animal liver and the lottery winner are as much in sympathy as the oyster and the moon. Against the protest that God doesn't concern himself with such minutiae, they argued that the entire cosmos was structured at the moment of creation so that certain causes precede others, even at vast removes of space. So there's no God intervening in the particulars. Rather, the life of the cosmos in its totality is programmed at the moment that God generates it out of fire. We cross here from natural cyclicity into the order of the event. Here is sympathy at its most closed, and we might say its most claustrophobic, signaling the incorporation of every last particular into the perfect, predetermined unfolding of cosmic life. It recuperates every found wallet, the wiggle of every worm, the cut of every finger. We seem to be winning and losing, says Agnes Martin, but in reality, there is no losing. We've begun to get a sense of what sympathy invites us to see in the world, not just pneuma or cohesion, but the complexity of the organism as both matter and mind. I've been describing these facets of sympathy in terms of openness and closedness, affectability and top-down organization. Sympathy is about the cut to the flesh and the ebb and flow of life within a diverse community of bodies. It's also, though, about the ordering of life and about a world that's not just tightly interwoven, but in fact constrained by a predetermined plan. By traversing this ground, we've started to map what I've been calling the dynamism of sympathy. And in my third lecture, I'll come back to sympathy as a locus for this particular tension between openness and closeness within the organic body, focusing in more detail on medicine and the relationship of the body and the mind. And there we could think more, too, about the way in which openness is part of a nature and the ways that it also destabilizes it, a discussion that will bring us closer to the larger questions of sympathy and nature that I'll be taking up in the last lecture. But what I've also started trying to map today, albeit more subtly, is another dynamism between the most micro level of the microcosmic and the most macro level of the macrocosmic. So in the domain of sympathy, I've said, there is a tarrying with parts and particulars, an attention to frogs and sea urchins and worms that's lacking in the metaphysics of Plato and even in Aristotle, where these organisms are concentrated in the biological texts. It is precisely this flattening of the world to the level of invertebrates that Favorinus complains about in a critique of Stoic astrology recounted by Alice Gellius. So he says that if the time, manner, and cause of men's life and death and all human affairs were in heaven, what would they say of flies, worms, sea urchins, and many other minute animals of land and sea? Are they too destroyed under the same laws, etc., etc.? So this is the most micro level. At the same time, by embedding organisms within larger webs of relation, sympathy also points to the pervasive mind of God or nature, so the most macro level. And this dynamic that I've just described between micro and macro also involves a kind of tension. There is, as we've seen, an asymmetry between the cosmos and the natures that it encompasses. The many cohesive bodies that populate the cosmos have the status of both parts and wholes. They're parts in the larger context of the cosmic whole, and yet they're also wholes in their own right, complete with internal sympathies and relationships to other wholes that are necessary for their lives. Another way of putting this would be in terms of a relationship between nature with a capital N and a plurality of natures. Indeed, one of the ways the Stoics talk about the top-down organizing force in the cosmos is as physis, or as nature. So in my lecture next week, I'm going to address the relationship of nature, capital N, and nature's little n head-on. At the same time, I'll be broadening the corpus of texts and authors under consideration beyond Stoicism. So on the one hand, I want to see where and how natures are referred to a trans-individual organizing principle called nature. This will mean expanding from cosmology to natural history. In this context, we'll see sympathy almost always works together with its opposite, antipathy, organizing friendships and enmities among species that have important consequences for individual survival. The crucial place occupied by the relation between species is why sympathy is an impetus to look up to a larger force called nature. On the other hand, I want to think about how nature with a capital N is realized differentially through different natures. So how do organizing principles of a life referred to nature, capital N, become immanent in a nature, little n? And I'll be paying special attention to what I'll call a fold between nature, capital N, and individual natures. As we've seen today, Stoic sympathy is itself something of a closed system. But by enlarging our lens on sympathy, I hope to show that the complexities it draws out participate in a broader reflection on organic life, the nature of the world, and the nature of nature in post-classical antiquity more generally. Thank you.
So I had a question about your text 2 from On Divination, and the claim that the Stoics collected much evidence. Can you describe what's going on in this passage as a kind of induction from these more specific examples about cosmic, or relations among disparate parts of the cosmos? And I just wondered, how do you think this kind of reasoning relates to another kind of argument that is not so inductive, but turns on particularly clear examples of the beauty of the cosmos? Because that seems to be another way that the Stoics get to this thought about the cosmic order.
Right.
And just looking at this text, it doesn't seem obvious that beauty is in play here, and yet that seems to be another part of their sense of the natural order. And it seems like, we can just see the Milky Way at night and be astonished and realize that the cosmos is a rational animal, and all the whole story about Pneuma can be derived in these other ways. What's the relation between those two thoughts?
The idea that you look up to the cosmos and observe its beauty in this kind of, empirical sense is so deeply embedded in the tradition already from Plato and probably before. So the Timaeus brings this out especially clearly, but in Aristotle you find this as well. And I think the Stoics are building on this tradition. I mean, they're very strongly part of a kind of notion that the world is created by an intelligent force, et cetera, et cetera. And so, this is one aspect that I think they're borrowing from what comes before. But I would stress, I think, the difference between that kind of argument, which has its roots in Plato and Aristotle and this tradition, and this kind of argument, which actually looks precisely to the smallest elements of the cosmos, which the kinds of elements that Aristotle says, at the beginning parts of animals, like, we have to look at these parts too if we want to have a grasp of nature, but not in this way that they might be sites for thinking about the cosmic whole, really, not with the same enthusiasm that the Stoics do. And so I think they're really original in saying, okay, these smallest elements, and we'll see, next week when I talk about oikeiosis, you have this really obsession with data from natural history and worms and shellfish, and that is what seems to me quite unique about their vision, that they're not at all concerned about scaling down to the level of, say, the invertebrates. So I think they're not incompatible with one another, but I think that one of them points to the embeddedness of Stoicism within a tradition that has already been established, and the other one points to a kind of departure from that tradition in this kind of, both big and small move at the same time.
So you don't think when they're looking at the worms that they're talking as much about the beauty there as, in the more cosmic case? Because it seems like some of the attention to the parts could also be a response to the beauty and order of the world, although maybe it's more obvious on the cosmic.
Yeah, I don't think that the beauty is sort of absent from here. We don't, and I guess the other thing to emphasize is that, of course, they're not just looking to the worm. What they're interested in is the relation. So the very kind of bringing the worm up to the level of the moon or the shellfish or whatever is part of what's going on. And so to the extent that the worm is sort of incorporated into a larger visibility of the relation, I think there's more continuity between the kind of beauty in terms of order that you're talking about in the notion of cosmos and what's going on here. So it's an important point that of course, sympathy is never just about one thing, but it's always about two things, and it's always about more than two things.
Sure, yeah.
I was sort of stuck on this image of the cut finger and what that kind of pain or disturbance does to the larger organism, and I was stuck on it precisely because I've been recently working on a particular choral ode of Seneca's. It's a very small piece, but in this ode it's in the Thyestes. You have this disorder that goes from the soul to the political realm, into the analogy between realms. I wouldn't say that there's any indication that there's sympathy between them, but there is a way in which the disturbance of one realm maps onto disturbance from the other realms. And so I'm wondering about the pain and the points where the harmony breaks down. I mean, is this also something that you would see as being encompassed within the larger framework of a sympathetic cosmos, or is that a real threat? You know, is some kind of disturbance a threat to, I mean, is that a threat to the cosmos?
Yeah, and the order of the cosmos. I mean, it's an interesting point. So I would say, a couple of things. I mean, first, I wouldn't rule out that there are Stoic overtones. I mean, Rosenmeyer has argued that, you know, in the dramas, actually, of Seneca, there's a real engagement with Stoic sympathy as a philosophical concept. But at the same time, one of the reasons I use this notion of conceptual habit is I'm not interested in this kind of doctrinal purity that somehow there's a notion of sympathy and then there's kind of people using the Stoic doctrine wrongly. In fact, I think Seneca might be coming at it, I mean, obviously from a tragic context, from a different angle. There's obviously a long tradition of thinking about the damage to the body in a larger political context, describing problems to the political organism, as it were, in terms of corruption to the body, in a strictly analogical sense. You know, Thucydides is probably, Thucydides too is a place where you might have a kind of more direct causal relation between the microcosm and the macrocosm. But I think probably what's going on, what I would want to wager is that in Seneca, once the kind of paradigm of sympathy is in place, this longer, or rather this trope with a longer history can get subsumed into a notion of the sympathetic cosmos. So I think that's possible. The second part of your question, so is it a threat? I think it is. You know, I mean, one of the things that I'm sort of trying to work through is how, at the microcosmic level, there's a notion of precisely this kind of vulnerability in the way in which one part can destabilize the entire whole. And we'll see that in medical texts again and again. But at the microcosmic level, that seems to be blocked by precisely the containment of all the parts by the whole, so that nothing is foreign, nothing can damage this organism. And yet, so there's no crossover from the part. And in fact, you really want all power to come from the active principle down to the parts rather than vice versa. It seems to me that in this context, the inversion of power that's being staged in the microcosmic example of Sextus is being allowed to bleed into the larger sense. And again, whether contrary to the Stoics in a way that the Stoics themselves, I think, would sort of doctrinally deny. But I think what's happening is that Seneca is sort of building on this long tradition in order to kind of introduce another notion of sympathy. Not foreign to the Stoics, because I've been trying to show how both sides are there, but sort of expanding the boundaries of, say, damage beyond the places where they're contained within Stoicism itself. So I think it's part of this world.
Gabriel.
Brooke, that was just a fabulous talk. Thank you. And I'm trying to understand what this unity is that the Stoics were seeing. How is it they were thinking of the unity of the cosmos through sympathy that would be different from the way, say, Plato thought of the unity of the cosmos or Aristotle? And so I guess my question really is focused, or comes from passage 4 from Sextus,
Right.
where he's talking about these different levels of unity, and there's the one with the hexes. And that's where I think you're saying that sympathy is a sign that there's
Yeah.
unity there. As opposed to the next level down, where you've got something that's like the relation between cables and turrets on a ship. And so I don't quite yet see what the difference is supposed to be. And I think it might be a little bit because I don't quite know, when do you know that you've got sympathy and when don't you? I mean, if you've got cables and turrets, then, you know, something happens on one part of the ship and it's going to affect things that happen in the other parts of the ship. So why isn't that a sign of there being the kind of unity that is present when
Yeah.
there really is genuine sympathy? What is real sympathy, such that we know we have some kind of unity, which is what? It's greater than the sort of structured ordering of the ship.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point because it's, the army, for example, is often used already in Plato as a collection of parts that don't add up to a whole. And in Verity Hart in her book has this kind of, like there are lots of ways of thinking about an army as a more cohesive unity. So there may be some artificiality to the examples. But I think with the ship example or the turret, I mean, so you might imagine that the way in which the suffering of a part is communicated to the whole is contingent. So it could be that there is a cable and the wind blows the cable and it, comes across the ship and knocks out, part of the cabin or whatever, or, something happens, the hole opens up and the whole sinks. So there could be those kinds of examples. But you can also imagine a case where, the ship is sitting on the beach and you take the anchor off and you put it aside and the ship is still there. The ship is still sort of itself. The entire ship has not been sort of collapsed as a unity. And I think the language, this notion of collapse in the example from Cicero is very strong. I mean, there's this sense that under no condition at any time could you affect the part and not have this radical collapse of the entire whole. So there's something about, not that the parts in the ship might not function together. Even you might say the ship on the beach is not really a ship. It's not in its proper context, and so it doesn't matter to take away the anchor in that context. But I think for the Stoics, it would be a much more sort of contingent notion of participation in the whole. There's a way, and then this idea that, you could have a survivor of the army, who's not affected. There's this notion of damage not being transmitted to the entire whole. So that seems to be the important distinction, that for the organic body there really is this kind of tautness, this kind of tensional, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a tensional medium where like any impact is going to be communicated to the whole, no matter how small, no matter how minor, whether it affects a minor function. It's always there. So I guess it's the way that we might think about, even at the level of a stone, that there's a kind of dynamic field that constitutes the properties of a stone, such that if you change those, what we might think of as chemical properties or something like that, if you change everything is going to change. It's not going to be the same type of thing.
So
Does that help?
Sound like it does help. It makes it sound like it's more about sort of continuity of matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I wouldn't have expected.
Yeah, and that's why I think, though, that, part of this argument is to say, well, so sympathy does belong to stones, and there are, ways of recognizing stones as validly participating in sympathy, not least of all because there's a long tradition of sympathy and antipathy between stones. The magnet is a paradigmatic case of sympathy, as we'll see. But at the same time, what really matters is organic life and organic bodies. And so that's why I think, that's where you get this notion that, any cut, any chain, anything is going to affect. Obviously, the whole doesn't collapse. That's a kind of exaggerated example, but there's a way in which there's no way to contain any intervention into the organic body merely at the point of intervention. And there are some sources that mention life as a kind of another, cut might not be the appropriate word, but another sort of level, so that between, there are three classes of bodies, and then you have these, the soma henomenon, but there might actually be another distinction between the body that's living and the body that's the stone. So there are some sources that actually try to make formal that distinction.
Dave.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. You made me think that there might be a really interesting tension between the Pneuma model and the notion of cosmos as a living body. Pneuma, is compatible with the idea of sort of everything being alive. But in another way, it seems kind of inert. That is, if everything's pneuma and everything is material, and pneuma pervades, or another way of saying that is that just everything is pneuma vibrating at different tonos. That seems like a really interestingly different thing from saying that the cosmos is an animal. And sympathy really makes more sense in the context of the cosmos as an animal in a way that it really didn't for me on the Pneuma model. So I'm wondering, is there something like a tension in Stoic thinking between those models, or did they perceive it like that, or is it
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because as I would take it, what you first talked about is pneuma being kind of everywhere. There's this kind of almost, panpsychism or animism that seems to not correspond to a notion of life. That, there are lots of stones don't look like they're living. So what would it mean for pneuma to sort of be immanent in these stones? That there's some kind of problem there. And I think, and then you have this notion of the cosmic animal, where you actually have the highest form of pneuma. And it is a problem, I think. I mean, I think there are ways around it. I mean, the most simple way to think about it is that pneuma is both everywhere and yet differentially expressed at different points. So through, in the sage, you're going to have a kind of very close relationship between the nature, the full nature of the pneuma of the cosmos qua animal, and the part within it. Whereas in a plant or in a stone, there's going to be more of a gap between the highest pneuma, the kind of capacity of the pneuma as reasoning, and how it's actually expressed. And this is something I'll talk a little bit about next week too, because I think you get two problems that open up. One is what does it mean for mind in some way to be immanent in things that seem mindless? In stones, but also in plants. And for the Stoics, you might think, well, it's precisely where it's not a problem, because physis, capital, N, capital Phi, is sort of perfectly expressed through a stone as a kind of, message for the stone. There's no difference between the nature of the stone and nature at that point. But from another perspective, you have precisely this problem. What does it mean for mind to be immanent in something that seems to be mindless? And then at the other end of the scale, you have the problem where you have the highest reasoning beings, let's say, human beings or sages, where they're closest to this highest principle in nature. And yet at the same time, precisely because they're so advanced, they should have an autonomy in relationship to this principle as a whole. And so then you get all the problems of determinism and free will that seem to be really come to the fore with Chrysippus, and Chrysippus' doctrines on fate are trying to deal with. So it's a little bit of a complicated way of getting into the question, but I think it really gets to this problem of what's the relationship between the overarching principle, the kind of highest state of the principle, and its immanent expression in natures. And you could either see it as a problem of there being too much mind for mindless things, or you could see it as a problem of being too much mind for mindful things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Maybe can I just follow up with it's just a kind of follow up to David. It does, it seemed like in what you were saying that what Sympathia names, right, is a sort of cosmological principle, right, as that principle is theorized from the bottom up, right? Whereas, it could equally be theorized, from the top down.
Yeah.
Right? So my question was precisely, why have you picked the sort of bottom up theorization to describe your project?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is it because of a kind of a sort of more forceful theorization of the kind of bottom up account in the sources, or?
Well, I tried to focus on both. So I spent a little bit more time on the question of affectability, because when you look at the sources, sympathy is explicitly being used in almost all cases to account for overall cohesion, unity, the integration of the parts into the whole, this kind of recuperation of the parts into the whole. So on the surface, I think there's more of the kind of top-down nature. So if I kind of, spent more time on the way in which sympathy can be theorized from the bottom up, it's to bring out what I think is a kind of more tropic, metaphorical role of sympathy, the sort of notion of what is the pathos, and what are the implications of making pathos the kind of way in which you constitute a community, because there are different candidates, I think, in the 4th century for imagining how you translate the relations between people in, say, any community onto the non-human. What is going to be the kind of general way of relating? And I don't think enough attention has been paid to the fact that when they choose Pathos, when they choose Sympathia, it looks really different from a notion of Symphonia, which is actually in many ways more established in the tradition. And that goes back to this question about the kind of way in which the beauty of the cosmos, comes down and hits, the sage, or the human with the soul kind of first. Whereas when you start with affectability, you're necessarily going to hit rocks first. It's the fact that bodies are all capable of being affected and affecting others, and these unified bodies are of a sort that those affections will have a particular impact on them. So I didn't want to say it's only bottom up.
No.
I wanted to sort of get both, but I wanted
yeah.
to sort of come at it
Yeah,
from a position that I think hasn't been appropriately brought out.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, Liz.
Thanks for a wonderful, very stimulating lecture. I would like to bring in a distinction between an active force and passive suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Because, my question, sympathia, signifies primarily, suffering, a joint suffering, joint distress, and so on. Now, that is made possible in the case of unified bodies, by this active force, which is Pneuma. Now, Pneuma, so I think this question came up in a number of questions, but the Pneuma, the Pneuma is never as such, is impervious to suffering. It's the body that's invested,
Right.
that's been shaped by Pneuma, that can suffer. So
Which is a complicated position because technically Pneuma is not the pure active principle.
on the Stoic view, it is.
But technically it's a compound of elements. So it becomes a kind of corporeal vehicle for the active principle. And it is functioning the way you described, but I think, just to bring out that already in that distinction is a kind of, I completely support what you're saying, it functions that way and the distinction is important, but I do think that there's a difficulty.
Okay, if you take it as identical with a divine power, it's not corporeal.
It shouldn't be
not
affected.
subject to suffering.
It's interesting because Sextus actually, criticizes the Stoic account and saying, God is suffering and therefore can be, clearly even in antiquity people have problems with this. Sorry, but go ahead.
Okay, I think I agree there are a lot of questions. But this Pneuma invests, but at least we can agree on this Pneuma invests even a little finger with an active force
Right.
as well as the ability to suffer. So, with the sympathia as well as what you might call a sort of synergy.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering how this kind of synergy or active force is related to the susceptibility or distress, and distress, as you call it, of things which are unified.
Yeah. So do you mean to get at the idea in which a finger is not just a kind of site of passivity, but also has its own kind of active?
Absolutely, which consists of, well, we can use another word, the coyotes.
Right. And I think what I would say there is that, so one way of thinking about it is that the same way in which there's a hierarchy of beings within the cosmos, because Pneuma as active principle is differentially expressed depending on whether there are more of the passive elements, earth and water mixed in with air and fire. So in the body do you have a hierarchy of elements, so that the finger is a kind of, it's clearly being invoked here as a kind of lowly part, because it's not the full soul, it's not the hegemonicon, it's not the kind of main site of control where the purest Pneuma is located. So it is integrated into the whole. It can affect the whole because it participates in the Pneuma of the whole and is sort of integrated into the nature of the whole. But what I was trying to get at is the way that this kind of bottom-up movement, which can seem to pose a threat to the whole, that the soul should be subject to this, the cut of a little finger, comes, I think, from the fact that some parts, because they're more matter-y, they really are more material, nevertheless, precisely because they're material and precisely because they're implicated in this active whole, can communicate their pain to the soul in a way that might be seen as disruptive or destabilizing. So does that help? I mean, so like I think it really comes down to the fact that there's this differential distribution of pneuma that helps account for what I'm going to see how well this language works. I sometimes try to talk about a horizontal axis and a vertical axis, and I don't know if it's more confusing or helpful, but like the horizontal axis is that all bodies, as it were, are kind of democratically bodies participating in the cosmic whole, and the vertical axis assumes that there are some bodies which are closer to mind and closer to the active principle, and that's the distinction I'm trying to get at with this emphasis on the finger as the kind of point of vulnerability. Does that help?
Okay, thanks.
Chris,
Yeah, hi Brooke, thanks again. This was great lecture. In the world that I inhabit, the world of magic, okay, there's this practical sense of powers in nature, but it's usually that sympathy is equally important as antipathy.
Yeah.
And see, I'm just curious, what happens to antipathy? Will you be talking about it?
Yeah. You'll see I'm always kind of like sympathy, and then in some senses, sympathy and antipathy. Sometimes I talk about, like in the Stoics, I think you have what I call solo sympathy. And what's important about solo sympathy is that it doesn't, it includes things that might be negative. So when Sextus, for example, talks about the communication of, say, bad climactic conditions, that's still sympathy, whereas in a setting where you have sympathy and antipathy, sympathy is going to describe relationships of mutual benefit, or places where, say, a being can assimilate food to itself. So obviously it's not good for the being that was eaten, but you know there is a kind of notion of syngeneia or something like that. And then antipathy is a kind of negative relationship. So when you have solo sympathy, it encompasses any form of relation. And that's what I think you see mostly in the Stoics. And in other settings, you very strongly have this notion of sympathies always coming together with antipathies. And I know in Bolus, the little bit we have from Bolus, it's obviously really important. And it's interesting because I've been wondering, so the short answer is I'll talk about this more next week, but I'll say a couple of things that are relevant to what I said today. There is a section on the nature of gods where we encounter things that I would describe as sympathies and antipathies between, you talk about, or Chrysippus talks about the relationship between the pinna and the pinnagar, these two kinds of shellfish. But he doesn't talk about it in the context of sympathy there. And he talks about, so another example is given of the antipathy, but it's not described as antipathy between the cabbage and the vine, which is a topos, goes way into the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance and so on. And so the fact that he does not talk about those occurrences, so there are examples, there's a whole list of examples, again, a list of cases where we can see the overarching power of nature in kind of putting individual natures in relationship to each other in these determinate ways. But he does not use the language of sympathy and antipathy. Suggests to me is sort of more evidence that there are these traditions that are moving together of sympathy, sympathia, and the medical tradition's another one, that are aware of each other and are being contaminated in ways by one another, and yet also sometimes trying to sort of carve off a kind of sympathy that's specific. So I think that Chrysippus probably doesn't talk about those things in terms of sympathia, because he doesn't want to confuse solo sympathy, that is this cosmic notion, with sympathies and antipathies. But next week I'll talk about, I think you actually have to see these in terms of a larger conversation about sympathy and antipathy. The only other thing I would say that I think is really crucial about antipathy and solo sympathy is that, so one thing that Foucault says in On the Order of Things, where he talks about sympathy as kind of the main way of imagining the organization of the world in 16th century thought. And that's going to be, sort of surpassed, sort of overcome with he wouldn't put it, actually he's kind of hard on sympathy. You get a new episteme and that's what happens. And he says you need antipathy to ensure that the whole system doesn't collapse. And so sometimes people think that antipathy is a necessary component of sympathy, or everything would become like everything else. And I think that's a mistake. I think that that's actually a kind of flippant way of thinking about things. Everything we were just talking about, the differential distribution of pneuma in the world, means that when the sympathetic cosmos does not mean all the parts are exactly the same. It does mean they're all in kinship with one another in a particular way, but kinship is not sameness. And so this idea that sometimes people get from Foucault that you need to have antipathy in a system in order to keep it from internally collapsing is wrong, I think. So I would say, that's not, so antipathy doesn't even come in the back door, except insofar as it shows up in cabbage and vine relations in the Stoics.